So the question says, briefly explain the history of development of computers from the first generation up to the latest development. So first begin by defining the generation of computers. And generation of computers in computer technology simply refers to the distinct phases in the technological advancement in computer architecture and hardware. These generations were often characterized by significant improvements such as in processing power, size, and capabilities. In total, there were 5 generations of computers known to date. So I'll begin by the first generation computers, and he said that the first generation computers was between the year 1946 to 1959, and the computers of the first generation used the vacuum tubes as their basic component of memory and circuits for the central processing units. And what were these vacuum tubes? These vacuum tubes were fragile glass-like devices which used filaments as a source of electrons, and at the same time they amplified the signals. Then these tubes worked like electric bulbs, produced a lot of heat, and they were also prone to frequent fusing because of the way of their installation. Then in the same generation, mainly bash operating systems were used, such as the punched cards, the paper tapes, and the magnetic tapes were as well used as the input and the output devices. The computers of this generation mainly used machine code programming languages because they were easy to use and understand, and mainly they were used for computational purposes. Then the next thing on that is the characteristics of these first generation computers. One of them is they were bulky in size, requiring large room for installation. Then the second of that, they used thousands of vacuum tubes, and these mainly emitted large amount of heat and burnt out easily. Then the third one on the characteristics, like the power consumption of these computers were very high due to their big size. Then the next one is the vacuum tubes used the filaments, and thus they had limited life. Why? Because these filaments could burn out easily, get exhausted, and were not easy to replace since it involved like assembling of very many components to come out with a single vacuum. Then the next one is that on that is slow input and output devices. Then also they were non-portable because of their size. It wasn't all that easy to move them from one place to another. Then the last one on the characteristics is that their commercial production was very difficult and costly. Why? Because it involved like assembling of very many individual components to come up with a single vacuum. Then from the characteristics, we state some of the examples. And the first example on that is the ENIAC. The second one is the EDIVAC. There is also UNIVAC, the IBM 701, then the IBM 650. So that one marked the end of the first generation. The next generation of the computers was the second generation computers, and the period of the second generation was estimated to be between 1959 to 1965. We find that in this generation, transistors were used compared to the first generation where the vacuum tubes were used. In this generation, the magnetic cores were used as primary memory, and the magnetic tape and magnetic disks were used as the secondary storage devices. In this generation also there was use of assembly language and high-level programming languages such as the Fortran, the COBOL, and the C++. Then the next thing on that, these second generation computers also still use the batch processing and multi-programming operation system, punched cards for feeding data and programs to the computers. You see that the second generation computers were increasingly used in businesses and industries for commercial data application like making of payroll and inventory control, compared to the first generation whereby they were mainly used for computation. Then leaving that, we move to the characteristics of the second generation computers. The first characteristic is the involved use of transistors compared to the first generation where vacuum tubes were used. Then they were also reliable in comparison to the first generation computers. The third one on that is they were smaller in size as compared to the first generation, and thus they required less space for installation. Then they generated less heat, still as compared to the first generation computers that produced a lot of heat. Then they consumed less electricity because of the reduction in their size compared to the larger vacuums of the first generation. Then same to the first generation, the second generation also had difficulty and high costs in production because thousands of individual transistors were assembled manually by hand into electronic circuits. The next one was that they had faster and larger primary and secondary storage. Then the last characteristic on that is they supported machine and assembly languages. Some of the example here included the CDC 604, then the CDC 3600. The next one on that is the third generation. The period of the third generation was between 1965 to 1971. Find that the computers of the third generation used integrated circuits in place of transistors. Like a single integrated circuit had many transistors, resistors, and capacitors along with their associated circuitry electronic components, which were usually wired manually. Then the IC had a parallel advance in technological development, which made the computers small in size, more reliable and efficient. In this generation, the remote processing, time sharing and multi-programming operation systems were also used. Then also there was also standardization of high programming languages such as the Fortran 2, from Fortran 2 to Fortran 4, then the COBOL, the Pascal and the BASIC also developed in this generation. Then some of the characteristics in this generation is that the integrated circuits were used. Then the next one is they were more reliable as compared to the first two generation. Then they were also smaller in size and required less space for installation. They were general purpose machines suitable for both scientific and commercial applications as compared to the first generation that was only used for computation. The examples on that include the IBM 360 series, the IBM 370-1, then there are also personal data processors. That one marks the end of the third generation. Then coming to the fourth generation, this period was estimated to be between 1971 to 1980. we find that the computers of the fourth generation use the very large-scale integrated circuits, having about 5 million transistors and other circuit elements and their associated circuits on a single heap, which made it possible to have microcomputers involved in the fourth generation. Then in this generation, the programming languages that were used mainly were the C, then the C++, then the D base. Coming to the characteristics, the first one is they used very large scale integrated systems. Then the second one is they were more reliable compared to the first three generations. Also the concept of internet was introduced during this same generation. The next one is that the great development in the field of networks involved in this generation. Then computers also became easily available. Then some of the examples included the DEC 10, the Star 1000, then the Cray 1, also known as the supercomputers. Then when you come to the fifth generation, is the period that was estimated to have begun in 1980 till to date, whereby the very large-scale integrated technology became ultra-large-scale integration technology, resulting in the production of microprocessor chips having 10 million electronic components. This generation is also based on parallel processing hardware and the artificial intelligence softwares. The artificial intelligence is an emerging branch in computer science, which interprets means and methods of making computers think like human beings, and it was mainly associated with programming languages such as the C, the C++, the Java, then the .NET. The artificial intelligence also included the JavaScript. Then when we move on to that, we see some of the examples that were involved in this generation. And the first one is the desktop computers. We have the now laptop computers, the notepad, the notebook computers, all involved in the fifth generation. Then some of the characteristics are that they are more user-friendly compared to those other generations. For example, the laptop computers. The second characteristic is that the availability of very powerful and compact computers at cheaper rates. Like recently, you can get like a 8 GB Dell at even 550,000, which is not so expensive compared to the times when the vacuum tubes were used. Then this generation also led to the development of true artificial intelligence, like the robots, the neural networks, game playing, development of expert system the expert system actually helping making decisions in real life situation and natural language understanding. Then from that, go to the second question. The second question was briefly explain the evolution of the Intel 86 and the ARM architecture. I begin with the Intel 86. The Intel 86 architecture evolved over the years, like from 29,000 transistor microprocessors that was first introduced to a quad-core Intel Core 2, which contained like 820 million transistors. Some of the main evolution of Intel x86 architecture included: number one is 8080. That was the world's first general purpose microprocessor. It was first used in personal computers, and it mainly contained 8-bit machine with 8-bit data path to memory. Then the second one was powerful than the first one. I realized that the first one was 8080, then when you come to the second one, it's 8086. So it was more powerful than the first one, and it was an 8-bit machine that had a wider data path of 16 bits and larger registers along with instruction queue. Then the third one on that is 80286. It was the extension of the 8086 that had a 16 MB instead of just 1 MB and contained two modes. The first one was real mode, and the first generation 16B protected code was the second mode on that. Then the fourth one was 80386. You realize that it was the first 32 bits machine. It was able to compete against the complexity and the power of the microcomputers and the mainframes. Actually, it was the first processor to support multitasking, like typing, printing, among others. Then the last on that is the ARIM architecture. Then the last one is the ARIM architecture. The ARIM in full form, actually, it means advanced RISC machine. The RISC of RISC. Okay, the ARIM makes 30 bits and 64 bits RISC multiprocessor core. For it was mainly involved like for storage, and it was developed at Akron Computer Limited of Cambridge between 1983 and 1985, before the RISC concept was introduced in 1980 at Stanford. Like the Akron started in 1983 by designing of the first commercial RISC machine called Akron RISC machine, now called the Advanced RISC machine, abbreviated as with an acronym ARM. Find that the ARM are smaller in size, they have reduced complexity, and the low power makes them more suitable for many devices because of their reduced instruction set, which require fewer transistors, and this enables smaller die size for the integrated circuits such as the memory chips.